Year after year, the World Schools Debating Championship gathers the best debaters from around the globe. This year's pandemic made that impossible, so we took it online. In this style of debate, there are two teams. The proposition team, which is in favor of the motion, and the opposition team, which is against it. Each side features 3 speakers giving 4 speeches. The first 2 speakers generally present constructive argumentation. The third primarily focuses on refutation, while the reply speaker summarizes the debate. For the prepared rounds, teams research the motions for weeks in advance. For the impromptu rounds, teams have only 1 hour to prepare after being told the motion.
Yeah. So this is interesting. Let me see if I'll try to message fast now.
Yeah, I think you're supposed to be in the Hong Kong, Sri Lanka room.
Yeah, that's what I thought I was too. I'm just messaging Viking now.
Just to check, am I audible on this mic? Is it working?
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Let's do a quick check with the judges then. I'll let the judges also.
Okay. Hi, my name is Theodore. I'm from Greece.
Hi, I am Christopher from South Africa.
Hi, I'm Cindy from China.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline. I'm the judge for Denmark, but I'm originally from Canada.
Okay. I think we are missing, hold on.
Year after year, the World Schools Debating Championship gathers the best debaters from around.
Distribute emergency and humanitarian aid through non-state groups linked to terrorism. Here.
Can everybody hear me? Okay, I would prefer to take POIs like written or with your hand or whatever, but I might not notice that. And so if I do not notice that, you give it orally so that I will definitely notice it. Everybody's ready for me to start speaking? Okay. If people around you are getting shot up, yes, you want the Band-Aid, but more than that, you want to stop the shooting. That's what we give you on side proposition. What is this debate about? This debate can be defined in many ways. We're going to be discussing, and this is going to be a legitimate understanding of the motion, the political branches of terror groups, which often control organizations which supply humanitarian aid. Examples of this would be the Orange Lodge in Northern Ireland, which supplied emergency aid to Protestants, but is also directly associated with terror groups such as the UVF and the UDA. Or another example would be the humanitarian branch of Hamas, which also supplied Palestinians in Gaza with food and water, but is also directly associated with a group which literally launches missiles at Israel. Notice two things here. A, most terror groups are raising a political issue, and therefore they have a political organization which provides this humanitarian aid. Secondly, any UN group in Gaza is going to have to talk with Hamas, and we don't think that this is the links which we're talking about, because in that case, everybody and any organization would be in this. We're talking about the groups which are directly associated with the terrorist organizations. What is our stance in this debate? Our stance is that the reason we need humanitarian aid is terror. It's because of fighting, it's because of the shooting, and that's what we want to stop, and that's how we're going to win this debate. Secondly, we believe that we're going to be giving better aid to the people on the ground the moment it's not coming through these really terrible terrorist organizations. These are going to be my points. First of all, talk about humanitarian aid, why it's so existent, why it's better. Secondly, we're talking about why we get significantly less support for terror and why that's so great. The third point is going to be about why terrorist groups have a perverse incentives and no accountability. I will now take a point of clarification or your POI.
The Houthi rebels have virtual autonomous control in Yemen. Would you starve out the millions of people who are at risk of starvation right now and not provide them aid through those links?
Thank you. I'm going to be talking about this in my point. We'll get to it. Wonderful. So humanitarian aid groups such as the UN or private NGOs are going to exist in these areas, and let's explain why. Because then ultimately, the international donors, which care about the people in these stricken areas and in these crises, are going to continue to be giving the same amount of money on both sides of the house. If they know that people are starving or are getting hurt, they want to provide this money, they want to provide band-aids, and they want to provide food. In the status quo, this money goes to the terror-linked groups. Why? 3 reasons. First of all, the international donors don't know or care what these groups or what they are. When you see that the Orange Lodge are giving out food, it isn't clear to you that they necessarily support the UVF, and you might not even know what the UVF is. But secondly, they're the first to exist there because that's where they started, that's where they originated, and this gives them the 2 advantages. First of all, more exposure. Secondly, the fact that they can consolidate their power. The third thing here is that once they had that initial advantage, they very quickly become a monopoly in these areas, and they have high barriers to entry. But when donors cannot give money to these groups, what they do instead is give that money to those private NGOs, to the UN groups that are operating in these areas. Why is this better? We think that the terrorist groups aren't going to stop first of all, why the terrorist groups aren't going to stop these groups from going in. First of all, it looks terrible when you stop the UN from literally giving the people in the area food and water. This is something which is going to harm you massively in terms of ever gaining any legitimacy, ever raising a state, or in any way gaining your political goals. But secondly, they want the people on the ground to have food and water. They care about the people on the ground. They don't want people on the ground dying. They don't want the health crisis in their area, and that's why they're going to be letting the UN in when the UN brings the food and brings the band-aids. But this means that we believe that NGOs are a viable alternative. But moreover, why do we think that there are better alternatives? We think that the incentives are better aligned with actually giving the aid to whoever needs it, as opposed to these groups which are related to terror, where the cause is more important. What does this look like? This looks like unfair allocation, where Protestants are going to be getting this money and this food, even when Catholics are literally starving in Northern Ireland. We're talking about the people in Gaza who aren't associated with Hamas not getting any access to these resources, not getting food, water, or electricity because that they didn't put Hamas on their ballot. We think that this is principally a terrible thing to do. We think that side opposition is supporting this mistreatment of these people, and we are very proud to stop that. Secondly, oftentimes these terror groups are skimming off a lot of the money which they get from these donations or from the food or supplies which they get for themselves. And many times this is very hard to track, and they're taking this money in, and therefore this money isn't getting to the people on the ground at the end of the day. I will now take a POI.
You say yourself that when you have it through these private aid groups, you don't know directly who you're aiding, but you also claim that it's bad when you fund terrorists at all. You don't know who you're funding. You're doing it on your side of the house.
Again, it will be illegal to fund these terrorist groups. It's very simple. Okay, so aside from the fact that we're massively improving the lives of the people on the ground, we also think that we're going to be making sure that we're getting less terror in the long term. Why? First of all, we think that a lot of the money ends up in the bank account of these groups. Two reasons. First of all, we think that they can simply take a lot of this money, which oftentimes come in monetary donations, or directly extort money or sell the food which they got from the private donors to the individuals on the ground, and that way gain that money for themselves and have more money to buy bombs and guns with. But secondly, often it's very hard to prove whether they're using this, but let's say they can take this money and buy a truck, and they usually use this truck for moving around food, but they can also use this truck, or they can also use the headquarters which they build to move around guns or to transfer guns, etc., which means that they can use those same resources to further their terrorist goals. And notice, this is very hard to prove that the truck that they bought with this money is also being used for guns, or that is actually what is happening. Secondly, though, we think that there's the psychological association which happens and arises in these areas when this happens. Because when every time that I get my weekly allocation of food, I need to go to Hamas, I need to go to the Orange Lodge, then firstly, I get lots of propaganda in my face. I meet with their people every week or every day, and they're telling me, oh, we are so great. Look, you should totally support us. But secondly, I have a positive association with them. They're the ones who are giving food to me. They're the ones who are providing band-aids to my family. And that means that at the end of the day, I'm going to be more supportive of them. Thirdly, though, we think that they simply have power over me, because if I want to have food or water or electricity, I'm going to need to go through them. And this gives them the power to ask things of me. What are the impacts of this at the bottom line? We think that this means that, first of all, we have more widespread populist support and less condemnation of the terrorist acts. This means that terror groups can act more freely, knowing that one, people are going to hide them. Secondly, people aren't going to testify. But moreover, we think that recruitment is much easier, because at the moment that people with these hard backgrounds are coming every week to get the food from you, and you're telling them, join us, look, we're so great, we're giving you food, then it's very likely that significant amounts of people are going to be recruited and come and do a terrorist attack for you or join your local militia, and that's going to be bad. At the end of the day, we solve this problem. We have less terrorist groups, we have less bombs, we have less guns, and we think that this wins us the debate, because if this is the root of the problem, and that's how we're solving it, I beg of you to propose.
Proposition speaker, I now invite the first opposition speaker.
Can I be heard now?
Yeah.
Okay, super. Share adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, at the point at which Israel tries to place a patent on the word link, I think they're losing this debate. What are we talking about in this debate? Firstly, I'm going to address the way they tried to frame this debate, and then I'm going to bring material and rebuttal included in those responses. Okay, what is this debate actually about? They tell us that the word linked means something much more specific than what it actually means. What the word linked means is what a state considers the word linked to mean. What this debate is about is what the United States considers the word linked means. If the United States thinks that that group is linked with terrorism, that group is linked with terrorism in the context of this debate. That's the debate that we're actually having. They narrowed it way too much. I think they need to contend with the reality of this debate. But even if you take them at their very best, and we're talking about these very specific UN forces that they want to talk about, I think for a UN force to in any way meaningfully engage or provide humanitarian aid, they probably have to benefit from the local knowledge of these groups that they're talking about. They probably have to benefit from the logistics that these local groups can provide. And at that point, I think they have to contend with the majority of this debate. Finally, on the material about aiding the majority of individuals, I think when they try to talk about how you're distancing a minority of individuals because on their side of the house they can help everyone, I don't think that's true. I think it's a wash. Why is that the case? Because for you as a humanitarian group to be allowed into a territory, I think you need to get the permission of the group that is within that territory. If you are going to try and focus on helping the enemies of that group, I don't think they're going to let you into that territory in any way whatsoever. What actually is this debate? Who are we talking about and who are we not talking about? That's what I will answer now. Who are we not talking about? We're not talking about groups without territory like Al-Qaeda. We're not talking about groups that would never accept aid. We're not talking about groups like ISIS that are entirely irrational actors. What we are talking about is the rational actors that exist in this debate. The rational actors with political interests who rely on local support. We're talking about WA State in Myanmar. We're talking about Houthi rebels in Yemen. I'm not saying they're perfect. I'm not saying they're angels, but I think they're the groups we're talking about in this debate because they're the groups who are likely to accept humanitarian aid. That's what they have to contend with. Panel, crucially, something to note is that this applies to any non-state actor with terror links. And what that means is, because what I told you in my rebuttal, states often label groups as terror groups, even if they're not terror groups, because they are diametrically opposed to the status quo, diametrically opposed to the incentives that state has. That looks like Saudi Arabia labeling the Houthi rebels as terrorist groups. It looks like Israel labeling the Palestinian Authority as a terrorist group. And what happens then is other nations follow suit because they've got more interest in that nation, not in that terrorist group, which means they become a terrorist group. These are the kind of people that we have to contend with in this debate. That is the reality. Our first point then, why Team Ireland gets civilian aid, but why Team Ireland gets civilian aid where Israel cannot get civilian aid. Why can Team Israel not do this? Two layers. Firstly, if they want to allow the state to give humanitarian aid, or if they want to allow the nearest state to give humanitarian aid, they can't do that. Why? Firstly, states have absolutely no control in these regions, right? We're talking about regions where non-state actors have semi or entirely autonomous control over a large majority of the area. That looks like the WA State Army being in control of the entire WA province in Myanmar. I don't think a state can in any way provide aid in any meaningful way on their side of the house because the WA Army has guns at their borders. But secondly, these states probably don't want to provide aid in any way whatsoever, right? And that is because these groups have caused that state harm. They are diametrically opposed to those interests. I, as the Saudi Arabian government, do not want to give aid to the Houthi rebels, do not want to give aid to the families and children of people fighting against me. I don't think that ever happens. But secondly, on NGOs, something they want to talk about. Firstly, as I already told you, I think an NGO is going to have to rely on the logistics that a local group can provide, the logistics of the group that they are calling terrorists to provide. And I think at that point, these become ad hoc non-state actors, right? These NGOs are benefiting directly from the aid of those non-state actors, and at the point at which that happens, they're probably more likely to be on our side of the house. But secondly, lots of that aid will probably end up in the hands of non-state actors, right? When an NGO hands out aid, it's probably very difficult to determine between who is and who isn't a terrorist, who is and who isn't a bad guy. I think it's very likely that a lot of aid ends up in the hands of terrorists on their side of the house if they want to use NGOs. And what that means is that on their very own metric of locking out terrorists, from receiving aid, I think they lose. That isn't even a metric that we have to contend with because we're fine to concede that. That's a metric and a burden that they only have on their side of the house. I think they lose it as well. how then do we on our side of the house get effective distribution when they don't? Firstly, what I told you in our context, that we can use it as a tool in the toolbox, right? We can give it to the non-state actors like the Wild State Army, like the Houthi rebels, who are likely to hand out humanitarian aid to the people within their borders because they don't want them to die, because they are their own countrymen, they think that they have a right to live, and they rely on the local support of those people to actually continue operating their operation. Sure, we're not going to use it in the instances of ISIS, but I think that's a wash on either side. Secondly, we have enforcement mechanisms on these groups. They don't. Why is that? Because when you give aid directly to those groups, it means if they do anything wrong, you can revoke that aid, right? We're not saying we have to give this aid to them all of the time. We're saying at the point at which that group does something actively harmful, that group does something egregious, we can revoke that aid. That is an enforcement mechanism that we have on our side of the house that they don't. But thirdly, it's just in the interest of these groups to distribute aid effectively, right? Because they don't want people dying. The reason they formed a militia, the reason they formed a new state is because they don't want people to be oppressed by the state that was oppressing them. I don't think it's realistic that these groups wouldn't distribute aid well. So the comparative then in the distribution of aid is that, sure, maybe in Iraq where ISIS has some territory, we don't distribute that aid. And maybe that aid isn't distributed perfectly or entirely equally because the non-state actor has it in their hands. But on their side of the house, states and NGOs just don't have the incentives, and if they do have the incentives, the ability to even get into these places, they get nothing on their side of the house. We get a substantial amount. Now what I'm going to prove to you is that independent of this point entirely, morally egregious not to give aid to these non-state actors. But before that, a POI.
Let's be very clear. If side opposition is claiming that the person who's more likely to spend money on treatments for people who need it for cholera and dysentery, as opposed to spending it on guns, is the Houthi rebels as opposed to the UN, we believe that their case is quite audacious.
Okay, this is something we have to clear up. What is humanitarian aid? Humanitarian aid is food. Humanitarian aid is medicine. We're not giving the Houthi rebels money or guns. That's just not something that is actually in the context of this debate in any way whatsoever. Why is this principle entirely independent of the outcomes? And it is because when you reinforce the ideas that because of outcome-related issues, it is okay to isolate millions of people because you don't want to fund a few terrorists, we think that at that point our principle becomes entirely independent of outcomes because that is so principally unjustifiable. Why is this morally egregious? Three reasons. Firstly, realistically, I think developing nations are taking the easy way out when they don't give aid to these non-state actors. Why is that? 100 years ago or 60 years ago, European colonial powers effectively came into Africa with a Sharpie, drew a map all over, drew some squiggly straight lines all over that map, and told them to have fun. They are in some way morally culpable for the fact that these non-state actors even exist in the first place. They have to engage with those non-state actors in a meaningful way. They have to help those people. But secondly, right, these people are just civilians. They are not terrorist groups. And the majority of times when we're giving aid to non-state actors, sure, the person at the top might be a little bit dodgy, but the people at the bottom are certainly not dodgy. They just want to receive some kind of aid. To not make that effort in the first place is once again morally egregious. But third, these people that they're trying to blame are in no way morally culpable. Just as I did not decide to be born in Ireland, a Houthi did not decide to be born in Yemen. I think we have a moral principle reason that we have to provide aid to those people. Look, panel, people in these places, people in these non-state areas don't die by the gun. They die by hunger, they die by dysentery. We allow those things to stop. I think we take this debate.
Thank the speaker. I now welcome the second proposition speaker.
May I begin? I would prefer POIs with like hands or a card, but if I don't react, then please do so. Like just ask, voice. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. It is a significant strategic mistake from side opposition to not spend a minute in their LO speech answering our entire second point about why terrorism is going to be, at the end of the day, better on our side, and why we think we are going to win the debate solely on that. Given that, they're already in a very problematic position, but I'm going to have quite a bit of rebuttal that shows you why, even in the aid question, we win there as well. and I'll have a substantive point about why terrorist groups have perverse incentives and no accountability measures. And finally, I'm going to weigh up why we think that even if we're going to lose, even if there is slightly less aid on our side of the house, why the simple fact that there's going to be less terrorism in the long term on our side is enough to win us the debate. Note panel, no engagement with this, even though it comes out right from first. Side opposition is in a problematic position already. Let's dive in, starting with rebuttal. Firstly, on the kind of weird semi-challenge they tried to give us on our definition, although we did explain to you why our definition is legitimate, etc., that we don't accept when they tell us, look, states can just label whoever they want as terrorist groups. Obviously, this is not the case, and the examples they gave us specifically about Israel as well are not true, by the way. But we think that if it fits under the definition of a terrorist group, meaning you're like actively targeting civilians, actively doing things that are harmful, and we consider you a terrorist group in general, then we have no problem protecting that if it does not fit under this criteria, then it's not something we need to defend. We don't really understand the purpose of this kind of strange challenge. Let's continue on with rebuttal, right? Firstly, they tell us generally that we're not going to have accountability over NGOs, that we don't know where the money is going to go, that they can revoke aid, etc. A few responses to this. One, we say, look, this is a comparative debate, right? We think that in general, we do have accountability measures over NGOs, or at the very least, we have more accountability measures over NGOs than we have over terrorist groups, right? NGOs are held to standards of integrity by Western societies. NGOs do need to report what they do with their money, where their money is going, how much money they're getting from who, etc. They do need to provide these reports. They do need to provide these statistics, this data, etc. We think we have more accountability measures over NGOs than we do over freaking terrorist groups. I'm going to be engaging with that more in my point, but generally we think that at the point at which their comparative is incredibly strange and we're just not sure why do terrorist groups have more accountability, then we just say fine. Secondly, on the idea of when they tell us that humanitarian aid is not going to be money, it's just going to be food, bandages, etc. So they have no idea how the terrorist groups are going to be using this to their advantage. A few answers here. One, we say this is not true in and of itself, right? We think that a lot of the time, this aid is in fact money. This aid is in fact something that terrorist groups can use directly in order to, for example, buy trucks or build headquarters, etc. Something that these trucks can be used in order to transport food, but they can also they can also be used in order to transport the terrorists to the fighting zones, etc. But secondly, we tell you, even if this is true, it just means that this food, this medical aid, etc. We think terrorist groups often use this aid to their advantage more so than they do to the population's advantage, right? So they, for example, are going to take more food for their soldiers as opposed to giving it to children. They're going to be taking more of the medical aid in order to help their wounded terrorists, as opposed to helping the local population. So we say this is not true, but even if this were true, we still think these terrorist groups use it to their advantage, right? Additionally, specifically when they give us the examples of like Houthis in Saudi Arabia, right? We say that the Houthis do accept the humanitarian aid. What is the difference here, right? The people stopping the aid to Yemen, specifically if they want to engage with that example, are not the Houthis, they are the Saudis, right? Tomorrow, when Saudi Arabia doesn't need to worry about this money indirectly funding terrorism, there's a higher chance on our side of the house that this money will actually get there. So even if that is the example they want to use, we win on that example as well. Before I continue, I will take a point of information.
In Yemen, a cashless society where markets have collapsed, what is the use of money as humanitarian aid? What are they spending goods on? They don't have a 7-Eleven. They have, a war zone. Like, why am I giving the money?
Okay, I didn't hear the full thing because it cut out for a second. But generally, we think that they have use for this money in general. And again, as I said, even if it's not like just monetary aid, they can still use this. They can still use the resources they get in order to help themselves, as opposed to the local population, something that was explained and not engaged with. Given that, let's move into my substantive. Why we think that comparatively these terrorist groups are going to be have more perverse incentives, and we have no accountability over them. Note that this also directly engages with the material we got from them as well. What are their incentives, right? What do terrorist groups want to achieve? We think that we think that generally speaking, we're talking about very extremist groups who have certain ideologies, who always like prefer who are going to prefer their goals and to make to whatever that is they want to achieve in their areas, as opposed to helping the local population, as opposed to seeming like defenders and saviors, etc. That is why we see organizations like Hamas using people as human shields. That is why we see them using hospitals or schools as their bases,
Question?
right? They prefer because they prefer to promote their ideologies, they prefer to promote their goals in that sense over helping the local people, right? So we think that already on that, NGOs clearly have way better incentives, right? We don't think they're going to be using people as human shields. We don't think that they want to build some kind of weird state inside these war zones, right? NGOs clearly from the start, as we already give you, their incentives are probably much better aligned with actually helping people than the terrorist groups are. So already side opposition's comparative here is incredibly strange. But secondly, we tell you about accountability, right? What is unique about terrorist groups? There is literally no like avenue of accountability in which we can actually test them, right? They're not like tied to international courts. They don't have to report their like tax things or whatever. They don't have any checks and balances or standards or Western standards of integrity that NGOs are in fact that the NGOs do need to uphold, right? So we think that at the end of the day, their ability to use their money in a way that to use the money or the aid they get in a way that benefits them without us having any way to track it is much, much worse on their side of the house. So we think that already on this comparative, we show you why we win there. But finally, let's discuss why we think that our best case of terrorism, why we show you the fact that there's just going to be less terrorism on our side of the house more important, right? We tell you that here simply that emergency aid is abandoned, that even if they have more aid on their side of the house, that is not actually going to be helping people in the long term in any meaningful way, that is not going to be solving the conflicts over there. When we show you how we systematically weaken these terrorist groups in the long term, when we show you how we prevent them from being able to build headquarters, how we prevent them from being able to get aid to their soldiers, how we prevent them from gaining more power in the long term, we show you why at the end of the day, the chances of things actually getting better on our side of the house are a lot bigger. At this point, we show you why even if there is slightly less aid in the short term on our side of the house, we just think preventing people from dying in the long term, actually being able to solve these conflicts in a meaningful way is significantly more important. We come to you at the stance from first speech. No response in LO. Hopefully, DLO will have a response. But regardless, the fact that we're winning this clash in and of itself is going to win us the debate. Proud to propose.
Thank you, second prop. I now welcome the second opposition speaker. Here.
Just offer POIs verbally. Chairperson, honorable adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen. It is insulting for Team Israel to say the hundreds of thousands of people starving behind conflict zones each year, to help them, it's a band-aid. They insult these people. They would stand over a Yemeni child and say, yes, hundreds of thousands of you die and have died over the past 2 years, but we think most of the dying takes place in the front lines, which is largely separated from where these people are starving away in camps. It is not only a falsehood, it is egregious. Three things in this debate. Firstly, looking over the debate so far. Secondly, weighing that up. And thirdly, bringing in a third substantive. So, what did they just not respond to? They have the audacity at the end of their last speech to say, we didn't respond to the clash. Notice that's the very first thing Jack did in his speech. He said their stance was squirreling the debate. The point at which they say, oh, we fund Hamas, but not the terror branch of Hamas, we say the fact that you're both calling them Hamas shows they are linked. You cannot stand over this in the debate. They didn't fight back on this, crucially as well. Jack told you this, we hear no response for why that link isn't legitimate, why that link isn't substantive, why we would get that funding. Also, we point out, they didn't respond to our principle whatsoever. On top of that, they say they don't respond to the idea that this international norm shuts off aid that exists where opposing interests exist internationally. This is acceptable in the status quo. We see it with the US funding Kurds despite Turkey recognizing them as terrorists. But this is no longer the case in their side of the house when you have an international norm where that is banned. And when the states decide independently and that norm proliferates, they can simply not stand for that. Secondly, then, in the way they try to squirrel the alternative. Firstly, we would say all the material on NGOs isn't comparative. We don't ban NGOs on our side of the house. Where we think NGOs would be more useful, we'll probably just fund NGOs. I think people can sort of use common sense that way, believe it or not. But on top of that, we would say that all the critiques they say of like why you can't fund terrorist organizations, it's equally true. It is symmetric to NGOs. We're not saying they're better, we're saying they're not being comparative. Because they're linked to terror branches when they need the support of those terror branches in those areas. And they themselves say they will get that support, they will get that covered. They are now linked, you can't fund them. We also say the metrics and accountability, such as pulling out funding from them, that equally applies to these terror organizations. That analysis is symmetric, not responsive. Past that though, in terms of if we were to say which one would you choose, we think largely it's a tool in the toolbox. So you probably use NGOs where NGOs will be effective. But when NGOs don't get buy-in from the local community, that's where you use this alternative. It's places where they may have distrust of like white saviors coming over and feeding them. When the community buy-in, we can use this alternative in those instances. Fourthly then, on this clash of guaranteeing proper use of aid, they give two reasons why the aid will be used properly on the ground. They say firstly, these private NGOs will be allowed in for legitimacy and because the terrorist organizations care about people on the ground. We say, yes, that is true. That is analysis for why the terrorist organizations will use the aid properly. On top of that then, they knife themselves and say, well, the terrorists actually don't care about people on the ground, they care about the political motivation. Develop past that knife and say that the buy-in on the ground is necessary for their political movement. It supersedes anything, it is the source of their power, they will use this properly. Fifthly then, on this idea of support, gaining support for terror, their second point. They say it bolsters fighting. We say, first of all, there wasn't a proper response to my POI. They just said, oh, we're banning that, even though they say in their first speech that when you have the Orange Lodge, apart from the fact that that's a false example, they say you don't know if you're funding a Catholic, if you're funding an IRI, IRMB, or UVF. We say that is symmetric to then our side, where you don't know who you're funding, so you're funding these terrorists anyway. So that falls. Also, crucially, this is not money. Because these are failed states. They don't respond to this. What can I buy as a Yemeni terrorist organization? What can I buy for buy-in on the ground? And secondly, the idea of garnering support. The key in support is not acceptance, not tolerance, not minimal buy-in, which bringing food would give, but radicalization. And the key to radicalization is narratives. And that brings me onto my third point, but before that, a little bit of way up. We think they're dealing with absolutes. There's no room for common sense on their side of the house. And even if we feed some terrorists on our side of the house, at least we should feed the civilians on the ground who are the mass deaths in these areas. Before I move on to POI.
We're not knifing. Clearly there is nuance, right? On both sides, the money and the aid does get into some extent. On your side, terrorist groups have an ability to take a portion or a significant portion of it to help themselves. On our side, NGOs prevent them from doing this to a way more significant extent than your side can.
That is the case, and it undermines their buy-in. When you see they are being giving aid from overseas, and you see that's not going to in the community, that undermines their buy-in. They have no incentive to do that. And also, as we tell you multiple times, it's likely not money. It's likely not guns. It is food, it is medicine, it is what they need. Thirdly then, on a third substantive, the thesis here is that this proposition makes it more difficult to fight terrorism. Note this clashes directly with their second and third points. Because, look, let's take Israel on the ground and say that all of these groups are evil. Who then is better at combating them? Two things to note, first of all. Firstly, we would say these struggles are born out of instability inherently. It is a climate where they are seen as an alternative, whereas as a failed state, there needs to be an alternative to spring up in that society. Secondly, under this, we would say that there's a state is too weak or broken to shut down these movements immediately. This means, crucially, that these movements rely on instability. And secondly, it means they often have multiple groups in one area. That's just like Syria, where you have Kurds, al-Nusra, democracy rebels, and ISIS all in the one area. Secondly, to note, we would say that these feed on propaganda and narratives. If we believe Israel
and said that these are all evil groups, that they have perverse incentives that are so horrible that no one can reconcile with. We say that necessitates radicalization. This is the key to them, and the key process to this is narratives, not giving you a bit of food every Wednesday. How then does this proposition bolster terrorist groups? Because firstly, it means we can no longer support the good actors in this society when they are labeled as terrorist groups. We can no longer fund the Kurds to defeat ISIS. That never happens on their side of the house. This means, first of all, that these groups are harder to defeat because you get less local forces fighting alongside you. And also then from that these regions stay unstable for longer. They stay under this control for longer. Secondly, we point out that instability in neighboring territories, when you're not funding the Kurds' humanitarian efforts, when they have food shortages, that leaves them unstable and ripe for the taking for these perverse groups. Thirdly, we would say it gives them an absolute narrative. It gives them the narrative they need to radicalize people. Look, this gives these terrorist organizations the room to say they want to starve us. They not only don't care about us, they want to kill us. That is what the developed nations say to us. That is an absolute incentive. It means more radicalization, not only at home in those countries, but also abroad. And not only does that mean you have more fighters, but in their third point, when they're talking about money, it means you get more funding from overseas, something which ISIS hugely rely on. When you're gifting them these absolute narratives, you are essentially directly funding terrorism. You are enabling them to get more funding. We oppose that. We think we should rid them of narratives, because in doing so, what this proposition does is it means struggles perpetuate and proliferate. Anyway, and the cost of that is not only that you have more humanitarian crises, but it means hundreds of thousands of people die starving, and this proposition stands over them and does nothing.
The second up speaker, I now welcome the third proposition speaker. Here.
We're not ignoring the dying kids in Yemen, nor are we ignoring the dying kids in Northern Ireland. What we're doing is creating a situation in which there are less terrorist groups which makes these kids die in the first place. Not only on the front lines, but there are less terrorist groups which create the economic crisis and the infrastructure and administrative crisis, which creates thousands, if not tens of thousands of individuals dying every time countries erupt into civil war. We're helping these kids, we're not harming them. Two clashes in today's debate. The first, where there is more terrorism, and the second is where there is more humanitarian aid. Notice how we can win each of these in order to win this debate, but largely if we've proven to you terrorism, we're going to be winning this debate by a mile. Beforehand, two extraneous responses. The first, they tell us is many different governments are going to define everyone who's slightly related to terrorists as terrorists. But notice how this doesn't engage with what they give us in the last substantive point as to why every time the government tags more and more groups as terrorists when they're not directly linked to terrorists, the governments pay a massive political price, right? We believe that the governments know this in many cases. We believe the governments are not stupid and can come up with this idea after 3 months of being professionals in it, much better than Side Ireland can do it in 15 minutes of thinking it in a debate. And consequently, we believe that the likelihood and the incentive to categorize many different groups who are not terrorists as terrorists is very, very low. Why? Because there's a massive political price to pay. But second of all, we just believe there are legal definitions which need to be taken into account, and it's not up for every different country to decide, right? There's a specific legal definition for terrorism, which is legitimate for us to defend in this debate. The definition is whether or not you try to actively harm innocents who are not directly involved in any type of political activity for a political goal on your side of the house. If a group does fall under the criteria, yes, we believe that they're terrorists. We believe that they're particularly targeting civilians who should not be taken into account. And yes, we were perfectly fine with doing this to them as well. Give the second extraneous response, they say, oh, they're fulfilling their moral burden because they're taking care of the individuals. Notice we prove that we're doing what's better for these individuals on the ground, then we win this clash as well. It's entirely contingent on the consequentialist question of whether or not we do better. Let's engage with terrorism, right? Because largely we get three things from terrorism from side propositions. But lastly, they tell us in this second speech as to why there's more terrorism on their side of the house, giving us two metrics. The first is that all of the less radical segments of these terrorist organizations are squashed because they no longer exist because they're not getting funding. But notice how this doesn't engage with the incentives of the government, right? We believe that if you are a clearly less radical segment within a society, for example, you are the least radical segment on the political issues of Northern Ireland, the government is unlikely to be categorizing you as a terrorist and is unlikely to be saying that you're linked to this terrorist group. Why? Because as they tell us, the government massively benefits from you continuing to be donated to, continuing to be strong, right? So in fact, what is the delta here? On the outside of the house, only these less radical segments of NGOs which are somewhat direct or connected to the society within the where the exclusion takes place exist, whereas on their side of the house also these exist, but a majority of the ones are extremist ones because we haven't cut out these, right? So in terms of this balance of power between the radicals and the non-radicals within terrorist-prone populations, we've got it better on our side of the house. The second thing it tells us is, oh, there's a narrative which becomes stronger as the government is trying to squash us out. But we just don't buy this in a second. A, it's severely underanalyzed, but B, we just say, look, the narrative which is being sent is while the government is stopping a variety of different bodies who are directly and indirectly funding bodies or terrorist organizations which have created the terrible circumstances which we win in the status quo, while the government is doing that, it's also massively supporting initiatives like the UN, which is going to be supplying food. Consequently, tomorrow, every time I turn up to get my soup kitchen, the propaganda which I'm being fed is that the government is good and the government is taking care of me and that I shouldn't join the terrorist organization, as opposed to on their side, where every time I'm turning up to the Orange Lodge, what people are telling me is that I should become a Protestant and I should fight for the UVF, because this is the only way to actually prevent the national cause. In terms of radicalization, it's worse on their side of the house when I'm actually access the propaganda which is being told to me significantly stronger because I'm constantly turning up to the terrorist headquarters. The second answers which they give us is, oh, it's not money, so it can't be used for terrorism. This is completely uncomparative and not engaging. Just raise a hand. Why? A, we tell you in many cases it is money, because even if you can't spend the money in Yemen, the fact that the body who's in charge of consolidating and giving aid to Yemen is a body which has also got some sort of international bodies or international presence. And if it needs to buy the cholera treatment from somewhere outside of Yemen, then the money which it gets from donations then already comes in terms of money in order to buy cholera, but it's also money which they can then skim off the top if it isn't enough on the answer. B, we just say even things which aren't necessarily money can be used to help terrorists. For example, bandages, for example, food, for example, trucks, which can then be used to deliver guns, for example, headquarters, all of the things they haven't engaged with. Largely, they tell us, oh, but there's no delta on our side of the house because NGOs can't recognize whether or not they're donating to terrorists because the donators don't know or don't care if they're donating to terrorists or not. But notice how they don't engage with our analysis here. Because while we tell you that donators in America who are donating to a certain NGO don't necessarily know if it's related or linked to terrorism, the government who is relevant and who's in charge of that area does. What does this mean? It means that tomorrow they can just stop the NGOs which are related or linked to terrorism from even being up or it being possible to donate to them because they don't allow them to publicize or campaign, which means that even if the American doesn't know whether or not he's funding a terrorist organization, the only groups which he can fund tomorrow, the only groups which are available and accessible to him and he's exposed to are ones which are in the first place NGOs. Why is this important to understand? Because this means that not only are we funding NGOs who are not directly related to terrorism, but also we believe that these NGOs can recognize whether or not the people whom they're giving food to are carrying guns and part of a terrorist organization or not. They can recognize whether the people, the truckloads of essentials and products that they're moving from one place to the other are filled with guns or filled with medication. At the end of the day, what do we show you with terrorism and isn't engagement? Already from the first speech, we tell you that terrorism is way worse on their side of the house for two reasons. A majority of the population tomorrow is dependent on terrorism and terrorist-linked groups for daily things which they need in order to survive. This means that every time they turn up to get their daily piece of bread, they're getting the propaganda fed to them. This means that psychologically they associate dependence and salvation with the terrorist group which is doing so much harm. Why is this terrible? Because we tell you already from our first speech, and this isn't engaged with, this is the only thing which allowed terrorist groups to survive. Because if they didn't have widespread popular support, if they couldn't count on people not testifying against them, if they couldn't count on the fact that they've had someone to hide for them when they need to, if they couldn't count on a constant stream of young recruits who are going to support them, young radicalized recruits who are going to support them, they wouldn't exist and they die out significantly quicker. We make sure this doesn't happen. We win this debate on that alone. Before I continue, I'll take a few lines.
You say that the government will give to less radical wings in these movements who aren't labeled as terrorists because the government have an incentive to do so. However, are you just being irrelevant for the sake of it? Because the fact is that they are linked to those wings which are labeled as terrorists and thus aren't in this debate.
Let's be very, very clear. According to side opposition, the government has got a massive amount of influence on what it regards as links or not. This means that if it has an incentive not to regard the links of the less radical segments as links which are enough for you to cut off funding, then it's not going to do so according to their own analysis, at which point we strengthen the less radical segments as opposed to the more radical segments. Let's weigh up this clash as the most important clash in this debate. Because the moment that we massively reduce crises, right, we're making sure that the people don't die in Yemen, that the Yemen crisis doesn't get nearly as severe as it's got. Why? Because terrorists and the presence of terrorist organizations in these areas is probably the worst thing which could ever happen to them. It means a collapse of the economy because people are no longer trading with you. It means a collapse of administrative bodies which would have otherwise been in charge of running things like hospital and running things like electricity grids. It means like a daily fear of being attacked and being shot at. We believe that the moment that we massively reduce the length that these things exist, even eradicate them completely, even if in the short term there is less emergency aid, the fact that we've gotten rid of this, we've gotten rid of the need of emergency aid in the first place, we've also made the situation way better for everyone. For these reasons, propose.
Third proposition speaker, I now welcome the third opposition speaker. Here.
Can I be heard clearly?
Yep.
Perfect. Chair, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, the moment that third speaker claims they can end conflicts by denying fighters food is the point at which they lose this debate. They say they need this food to survive, right? But at the point at which I'm willing to starve millions of people to get rid of 100 fighters, I'm dealing with a very radical government that is not going to treat me very well if I put down my arms. They talk a lot about Northern Ireland, right? But the reason why Northern Ireland ended well was because we gave amnesty to people. The government wasn't radical. They had a peace and reconciliation process, right? Picture the mind of a terrorist. If I'm knowing that the government is willing to starve its own people and put them at risk in order to get me out, are they also willing to torture me in a jail? Are they also willing to lock me away and throw away the key? The moment to which the government becomes so radical they put that many people at risk, these terrorists stop being the rational actors we talk about and start being fundamentalists. They'll dig in their heels and millions will suffer in the process that third speaker talks about. 3 questions in this speech. Firstly, on aid distribution. Secondly, on the principled clash. And lastly, on combating terrorism. Let's talk about aid distribution. Note in their second speech, they kind of treated this like a clash between NGOs and terrorist groups. We've cleared this up in our second. We're fine with NGOs when they're more effective. But on the comparative, there are instances in which terrorist-linked organizations are simply going to be better. But more than that, right? We tell you you're going to get less NGO involvement on the ground for a number of reasons. Firstly, we tell you that they say, oh, we just define these groups as any group that engages with violence. Note, panel, that international norms aren't a court of law. You write something down on a piece of paper and governments decide what that norm means to them, right? Let's look at it this way. The UN is notorious for depriving food for sexual favors with their peacekeepers on the ground. That is an act of harm towards civilians that can demonstrably be proven. So does the UN get access at this point? I would say, right, if law worked, like if you cause harm the way they cause it, then you're a terrorist organization. There isn't any aid going to these organizations. But let's take them at their best, right? What the thrust of this really is Saudi Arabia is going to decide that the Houthis are a terrorist organization. They say it's in their interest to feed these people. They don't care about them. They're engaging in a genocide. It is in their active interest to label these organizations as terrorist groups. And at the point at which they say it's not in their interest to do that, it's completely ridiculous. They're literally launching missiles into buses filled with children. We want that aid going to those people. We don't want them labeled as terrorists. But let's take them at their very best, right? They say, right, well, just deal with the less radical wing. No, panel, that this is just swirling the motion. The point at which they try to use this as a tool in the toolbox. If that person is linked with terrorist groups, they are linked with terrorist groups. The state cannot decide for themselves. You don't have fiat in this debate to do that, oh, this person, they're engaged in terrorism, but they're not as bad as ISIS, so we're going to give them food. That is our policy. They cannot co-opt it and claim it that they just simply can. But lastly on this clash, right, let's say you're not sure who to side with. I would say, even if what I'm saying isn't true, it introduces a massive chilling effect on NGOs and UN organizations, international bodies who provide aid. Why is that the case? Firstly, because they don't want to lose the donor support that they talk about. They say, oh, NGOs can decide who's carrying guns and who isn't. They don't want that rap. International donors don't want to be associated with that type of thing. The moment in which you can label these organizations terrorists, you might get lots of malaria nets throughout Africa. That's what people are now going to start funding. But you don't get any aid in Yemen. You don't get any aid in the places in which people are most vulnerable, because no organization wants to risk being associated with that kind of label, and no private donor does either. But secondly, right, we tell you, the point at which they need to disassociate themselves from the infrastructure on the ground that we tell you about in our first speech, that's the point at which they're far less effective, where they can't cooperate with that terrorist organization, where they can't use their logistical support, where they can't engage with them, because based on their very flimsy definition, they can be labeled as terrorists. Their jobs become much less effective, and millions of people are at risk. At that stage, we win that clash based on the chilling effect alone. But let's weigh this up, right? They say the moment we end terrorism, these conflicts cease to exist. No panel, that the Islamic State does not hold territory in Iraq anymore, but they're a decentralized insurgency that can still destroy that country to the point at which it is a failed state. If these insurgency groups can just operate behind closed doors, I'm not really sure how much they're changing. They're probably still a huge conflict in those areas. But let's weigh it up. We have a tangible risk to these people. They say combat deaths are more important. No, they're not. Civilians are never on the front lines. They're actually rarely in the line of fire. What they are at risk of is being behind those front lines and no food or medicine getting to them. They put millions of people at risk of starvation in Yemen for the sake of killing some Houthi rebels or bringing them to justice. That is a harm we were never willing to weigh in favor of them. That's why we win that clash. But secondly, let's talk about the principled claim, right? We've won that clash. That's the only grounds we're willing to engage in. They say this is entirely dependent on practical harms. No, it's not, because we want to cooperate with these people. We want to bring them to the table because the West and developed nations need to recognize that they're morally culpable for their actions, so they can't isolate and alienate these people any longer. They have to treat them as legitimate political actors because they are such, because the West and the developed world is the one that caused these problems. We give you 3 reasons. Firstly, because the West is largely the ones that created these problems in the first place. They went into Africa with a Sharpie, said, here's a bunch of fun borders. I hope you don't have any ethnic conflicts. They went into Iraq. They went into Afghanistan. They've interfered in everyone's international relations. They have a duty to these people to at least help them the best way they can, not to label them as illegitimate, even though they're the reasons why they would be considered illegitimate in the first place. Secondly, we tell you, even if that isn't true, these civilians never chose that life. They never chose to be associated with a terrorist group. They themselves admit in their third speech that some civilians are entirely dependent on these terrorist groups for funding, and we don't want that to be a propaganda mechanism. I don't care if they're being propagandized. I don't want them to starve. I don't want them to go ill. I don't want them to die. We have a duty to help those people that they admit exist on their side of the house. Thirdly and finally, right, when it comes to this principle of clash, any moment that you label a terrorist organization a terrorist group, it makes the jobs of NGOs just far less effective, to the point at which it is so alienating, you can't do any of the practical things they claim this principle is linked to. So really, we beat them on both principled and practical grounds when it comes to this clash. I'll take a POI.
Let's be very clear. The casualties of a terrorist organization in a civil war are not only the people who die on the front lines. They're all of the people who lose their job because there's no longer an economy. They're all the people who can no longer outfit healthcare or welfare because there's no longer bodies in charge.
Those are the people we need to get aid to, because those terrorist groups are still going to exist even if they don't control territory anymore. You're just not listening to what I'm saying. Those terrorist groups still exist. There are still people suffering. There are still people starving. We have a way we can get aid to them much more effective than you can, so we win on those grounds. Let's lastly talk about combating terrorism. The reason why I'm spending little time on this panel is because their analysis was so simplistic. 2 responses. Firstly, when it comes to money, right, they say, oh, I can buy things internationally. But I, as an NGO, I, as the UN, whoever I'm using to distribute this funding, I'm not going to give them cash if I realize they could spend it on guns. Because civilians, right, this aid is designed for civilians. Civilians can't buy anything with money in these societies. They have no use for it. What they have use for is things like medicine, things like food. So they just assert that this is true, but it's completely ridiculous that the UN would ever give shipments of guns and money to Somali pirates. No, they give food and medicine. Secondly, right, even if it is food, let's take them at their very best. Let's weigh this up and weigh it out of the debate. We are fine with some ISIS not ISIS, but like any organization we're funding being fed, right? Because there's millions of people at risk. What we're not fine with is like how much harm are we really causing here? Those groups that they call so evil, right, are likely just going to loot and pillage and feed themselves. Do people still starve on their side of the house? Those fighter groups are a much smaller population. They can sustain themselves on a much smaller amount of food. And any kind of fighter, I don't care if they're more full, the fact that they're being fed already on your side of the house and can still engage in terrorism is a huge harm. They also didn't engage with any other material about radicalization and propaganda. And on those grounds alone, we really should take this debate. They locked out NGOs who aren't linked to terrorism. They locked us out and created a huge chilling effect on the international community and leave millions of people at risk. That was always more important than some terrorists being brought to justice. Never been happier to oppose.
Now invite the opposition reply speaker. Here.
Can I be heard?
Yeah.
Oh. Chair, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, just as there were two sides in this debate, there were two ideas in this debate. And our idea was one of rationalism, one of solutions, maybe solutions that took a little bit longer, but one that prevented the deaths of millions of people. And the other was one of ideologies. The other was one of preventing terrorism at all costs, at preventing terrorism at the cost of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives. I think we took this debate. Two questions, firstly on the provision of aid. Why do we get more aid? We told you very simply that it's just the easiest and best way to get aid into countries in a meaningful way if you do it through these non-state actors. This is really important in this debate because firstly, we're talking about the majority of people when we're talking about aid, right? Way more people are affected by this aid than are affected by terrorism. We told you that. Secondly, these people, as we told you in our principle, were the least morally culpable. They need to be weighed the highest in this debate. The civilians we get aid to are the most important people in this debate. Why then did they not get aid on their side of the house? We told you two things. Firstly, when it came to states, they just probably didn't want to because these non-state organizations were diametrically opposed. But secondly, even if states did want to, they never had the infrastructure. The big clash then came down to NGOs. We told you for an NGO to be successful in any way whatsoever, they needed to probably have the aid from terrorist groups, the aid from non-state actors, just for logistics, just to get through that jungle or to get through that barren area, to understand how they could get through that area. But crucially, because of that, these NGOs were probably an example for our side of the house, right? Because they were ad hoc relying on these non-state actors, but even more importantly, on their side of the house, because of the chilling effect, because of the fact that these NGOs didn't want to be labelled in any way whatsoever associated with a non-state actor and lose their funding, they probably never went into WAS state. They probably never went into Yemen in the first place. Which means on our side of the house, we probably get way more NGOs going into these places. We definitely get way more non-state actors receiving humanitarian aid. And realistically, what they're left with on their side of the house is less NGOs giving aid, and in this obscure instance where a state gives aid, a state giving aid. But let's talk about the comparative then. I think it's very, very possible that on their side of the house, sometimes guns in their obscure money example, or sometimes a little bit of extra food gets into the hands of WAS state army. I think that is way, way, way less important than thousands of people getting food, than thousands of people getting medicines. And I think that's very realistic because these actors we were talking about weren't ISIS. We were talking about very rational actors. We were talking about actors that had goals, that wanted to achieve something. So I think we very, very clearly won that clash, right? We we had a relatively rational actor who wanted to remain in power, handing out aid on large volumes to save thousands of lives. I think we won this debate clearly. But let's deal with their outcomes and terrorism point, because you still might be a little bit confused over that panel. This clash is just way less important, because ultimately terrorism, as horrible as it is, affects a significantly smaller amount of people, or even at their best, affects the soldiers on the front line of this war, not the civilians in the back. They're affected by aid. They told you that terrorism and these wars stop because firstly, terrorists get hungry and they surrender. And secondly, they probably lose support, and that means that it becomes significantly harder for them to maintain that support. But that was untrue. We told you that. Firstly, in our second speech, we told you that when these people are in fear that if they surrender, they will be tortured and killed by Saudi Arabia, they don't surrender. They just become significantly more radicalized, and all of their terrorism harms on their side of the house stay on their side of the house and grow exponentially. But secondly, on the comparative, at best, if we ignore that, and if they manage to end the struggles, to end the wars, I think our side is significantly happier for it to take an extra year, for us to do constructively by feeding civilians, by getting these non-state actors on our side, bringing them to the table. I think if it takes an extra year to end that struggle, but thousands, if not tens of thousands of people don't die of dysentery, don't die of starvation, I still think we, by an extremely large margin, win this debate.
Now I invite the prop reply, a speech, and to conclude this debate.
May I begin?
Yeah.
Great. The opposition whip concedes that on our side of the House, terrorist groups are likely to have less control over these areas. That is a huge concession they make, and we're going to show you why the fact that terrorism is better on our side of the House is going to be enough for us to win this debate. Two questions, therefore. Firstly, on aid, and secondly, on where terrorism is worse. We're going to show you why we think we won the first one, but even if we didn't, winning the second one is enough for us to win the debate as a whole. Let's begin with aid. Look, we generally don't accept the fact that they try to frame it as if we have literally no aid on our side of the House, the fact that they're going to have tens of thousands of people starving and dying, etc. We don't think that is a comparative. We think we framed to you from the start why we think there are mechanisms and good mechanisms on our side of the House for getting aid. One, because we think that we're going to have enough NGOs, even if we have slightly less, at least we're going to have enough NGOs who are going to be able to provide this. We think they are going to be let in, and note that the reasons for them to be let into these areas is something that side opposition agreed with us, from the mere fact that these terrorist organizations are not going to prevent every sort of aid from entering in. And if the UN is bringing food and water, they're not going to say, we're not going to let them in. We didn't think that is engaged with. We also think that they're going to be fairly generally trusted enough in order to bring people food, right? So we think that on a general scale, we show you why we have enough NGOs on our side of the House, why they are going to be able to bring people food. We think that at the end of the day, we think that specifically their assumption here, in the sense that they assume that there are NGOs on their side of the House as well as the terrorist organizations. We show you from the start why we think that at the point at which the terrorist organizations or their proxies do exist, it prevents NGOs from existing in the first place. This is analysis that comes out from first and was not engaged with. So we think that we show you why on our side there are enough mechanisms for aid to exist. We don't think there's a massive delta here. Let's talk then about then let's move on to the question of where the terrorism is worse. Firstly, engaging with the metric on which the proposition whip tries to weigh aid as the more important question, right? He tells us that civilians are never in the front lines anyways. Therefore, we think that we specifically should weigh the fact that they are starving, etc. A, I explained to you why in many cases the comparative is not starvation, but B, we simply think it is a blatant lie when they tell us civilians aren't in the front lines and aren't affected by these terrorist groups, right? Civilians are used as human shields by organizations like Hamas. Civilians have their schools bombed, their hospitals bombed, their houses bombed by the wars these terrorist organizations create. Their economy is ruined by these terrorist organizations. They can't feel safe. They can't walk on the streets because of the fact that these terrorist organizations are there. We don't accept the comparative that says, look, we simply don't think there's damage here. They don't get in the front lines anyway. That is totally not true. We already talked about this. Why then do we think winning on this clash is enough for us to win the debate? We show you at the end of the day why we think, and again with the concession that we got from the whip on why they're just going to have less control over these areas. We think that at the end of the day, aid is going to be abandoned. Aid is not going to solve anything meaningful in the long term. They're not going to be able to resolve these conflicts on our side of the house. On their side, maybe more people get more medicine for cholera. On our side of the house, there's going to be much less cholera and humanitarian crises continuing and perpetuating in these places in the first place. We think that is a much bigger impact. We think that is a world we generally prefer to live in, right? We think that at the point at which terrorist organizations on our side of the house have less way to get their propaganda to civilians, have less way to recruit, at the point at which they have less control over these areas, as the concession we got from the opposition, at the point at which they don't have control over people's lives to the extent that they can use them as human shields, to the extent that they can completely ruin the economy, to the extent that they can do horrible things to the civilians on the ground, at the extent to which we solve these things in the long term much better than side opposition does, we show you why our world at the end of the day is better. For all of these reasons, please propose.
All right, I thank both teams for a splendid debate. Judges, we will now move into a breakout room. Speakers, could you quickly type in your names as per speaking order as well? I'm sorry, this should have been done at the beginning of the debate, but Team Israel and Team Ireland, if you can.
Year after year, the World Schools Debating Championship gathers the best debaters from around the globe. This year's pandemic made that impossible, so we took it online. In this style of debate, there are two teams. The proposition team, which is in favor of the motion, and the opposition team, which is against it. Each side features 3 speakers giving 4 speeches. The first 2 speakers generally present constructive argumentation. The third primarily focuses on refutation, while the reply speaker summarizes the debate. For the prepared rounds, teams research the motions for weeks in advance. For the impromptu rounds, teams have only 1 hour to prepare after being told the motion.